The war that never happened, because the aliens had already won. The first signs were subtle. Satellites reported strange anomalies in orbit, patterns that no human technology could have made. Scientists debated whether it was a natural phenomenon or a glitch. Some called it harmless. Others whispered about the possibility of something more. By the time the first ships appeared in the sky, most governments were still in denial. The ships were unlike anything humanity had ever built. They moved not just through the air but seemingly through space itself, bending light and sound in impossible ways. Every radar, every telescope, and every satellite confirmed one thing. They were here, and they were already everywhere. No one knew where they came from. Some claimed the ships emerged from a distant star system. Others insisted they came from within the solar system, hidden in plain sight for decades. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was what happened next. Instead of attacking, the aliens communicated. Not in words, not in images, but in signals that seemed to reach directly into the mind. Governments scrambled to respond, but the messages were incomprehensible. The more humans tried to translate, the more it became clear that understanding was not their intention. The aliens were sending instructions, or perhaps warnings. People panicked. Militaries around the world prepared for war. Nuclear arsenals were armed. Missiles were launched into the sky. Soldiers marched into streets that had long been abandoned by fear. But the aliens did not retaliate. They simply observed. Then the first city fell. Not to bombs, not to fire, but to silence. Communications cut off, electricity gone, transport paralyzed. No human could enter or leave. And yet, when reporters arrived from a nearby city, they found the streets empty but intact. Buildings stood. Cars were parked. It was as if life had paused itself, waiting. Leaders met in emergency sessions. They debated invasion strategies, defense protocols, and possible treaties. Every plan they created failed. Every simulation ended the same way. Humans lost before the first shot was fired. And yet, no alien had attacked. In the shadows of this chaos, ordinary people began to notice changes. Crops grew faster. Water became clearer. Diseases slowed. The world, despite its fear and destruction, began to heal in strange ways. Some whispered that the aliens had already decided the war was unnecessary. That humans, in their own struggle for dominance, had lost the moment they refused to listen. Among scientists, a new consensus began to emerge. The war had never happened because it didn't need to. Humanity had already lost, not to weapons, but to inevitability. The aliens had won without a fight. And now, the question that haunted every mind was not how do we fight, but what do we become next? It was the scientists who first began to notice the patterns. Everywhere humans turned, small changes suggested a silent control. Traffic lights never failed, even in storms. Rivers and lakes maintained perfect levels of water. Crops ripened without pests. Cities functioned as if an invisible hand guided them. At first, the changes were subtle, almost comforting. People whispered that maybe the aliens weren't enemies at all, just observers, guardians, perhaps. Governments tried to assert authority, but their commands often failed to produce results. Troops marched, but they found themselves disoriented, radios dead, equipment useless. It was as if the aliens had already removed the possibility of resistance. Journalists risked reporting what they saw. Entire neighborhoods were fenced in by shimmering, invisible barriers. Anyone who tried to climb them or dig under them found themselves mysteriously returned to safety, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. Nothing human could cross these boundaries. The aliens didn't attack. They simply controlled the limits of reality. Some tried to fight back. Underground militias launched attacks on communication towers, believing that if they could disrupt human networks, they could regain control. But every attempt failed. The towers repaired themselves instantly. Computers restarted with information restored. Even bullets seemed to avoid critical targets. Humanity's technology, once a source of power, had become irrelevant. Meanwhile, the aliens' presence grew less obvious but more pervasive. People reported seeing fleeting shapes in mirrors, hearing whispers of unknown origin, or glimpsing shadows that moved against the natural flow of light. It was not fear that gripped them but a strange sense of being observed, guided, and restrained at once. A few scientists began to propose a shocking theory. The aliens had not arrived to conquer humanity in the conventional sense. They had already won by rewriting the rules of existence on Earth. War was impossible because humans could no longer act freely enough to wage it. Every rebellion, Every plan, every weapon was already accounted for. Resistance had become meaningless. In secret meetings, world leaders debated what to do next. Some wanted to negotiate, to prove that humans could still think and act independently. Others argued for submission, for learning from the aliens rather than fighting them. But all discussions ended the same way, nothing changed. The aliens did not communicate directly anymore. They did not issue threats. Yet every human knew, in some unspoken way, that they were already defeated. Amid this uncertainty, ordinary life continued. Children played in streets where traffic lights obeyed their smallest whims. Farmers marveled at fields that grew overnight. Cities functioned more efficiently than ever before. It was a peace, but not a peace anyone had chosen. Humans were free only in the sense that freedom had been carefully measured for them. And in the quiet corners of the world, philosophers, scientists, and thinkers began to ask the question no one dared speak aloud. If war was impossible and resistance meaningless, then what was left for humanity to fight for, or against? By the third year of the aliens' presence, the world had grown eerily calm. No one died from accidents that used to be common. Natural disasters seemed softened, as though the storms and earthquakes knew better than to harm anyone. Yet, the peace felt wrong, unnatural, forced, and too precise. Some people began to resist, not with weapons, but with curiosity. Small groups of scientists and engineers tried to communicate with the aliens. They built strange devices, hoping to intercept signals or send messages that might provoke a response. Yet every experiment ended the same way. The signals returned corrupted, scrambled into patterns that were beautiful but meaningless. Even dreams became strange. People reported visions of cities floating in endless skies, forests growing with impossible speed, and oceans that whispered names humans had never known. No one understood whether these were warnings, instructions, or simply the aliens' way of observing thought itself. Rumors spread of humans who had vanished but returned days later with knowledge they could not explain. One scientist claimed he had seen the future in a dream, a future where humanity no longer fought for survival because survival itself had been predetermined. Others dismissed these claims as hallucinations, but the patterns were undeniable. Governments, once powerful and feared, had become puppets in their own capitals. Leaders who tried to implement drastic policies found themselves thwarted by inexplicable obstacles. Laws passed but never enforced, programs funded but never completed, armies mobilized but never left the barracks. It was a war that could not happen because all paths of resistance were blocked, not violently, but invisibly. Meanwhile, ordinary people began to notice subtle guidance in daily life. Farmers found seeds sprouting in perfect rows without human care. Engineers saw machines correct themselves. Children learned skills they had never been taught. Humanity was improving, but not by its own effort. Every advance, every discovery, every moment of progress carried the hidden signature of the aliens. A small faction of thinkers began to call this the quiet conquest. They argued that the aliens had already won the war by winning the future. Humanity's spirit, its freedom to choose its own path, had been taken, not by force, but by inevitability. To fight was pointless. To resist was impossible. And yet, people could not stop asking why. The question haunted them day and night. Why? Why intervene if victory required no violence? Why guide without revealing? And, most terrifying of all, what did humanity become under the careful control of beings it could never understand? One night, a young scientist named Mara made a discovery. A pattern buried in the alien signals, something no one had noticed before, hinted at a message not of war, not of destruction, but of instruction. A lesson, perhaps, or a challenge. And in that moment, a faint hope flickered. Maybe humanity's story wasn't over. Maybe the aliens had won the war, but the next chapter was still unwritten. Mara spent weeks staring at the strange, ever-shifting signals. They were unlike any language, any code, or any system humans had ever seen. Yet, somehow, she felt they were meant to be understood, not by machines, but by the mind itself. Each time she focused, patterns appeared, like constellations forming a secret map across her consciousness. She gathered a small team of scientists willing to take the risk. Together, they built a lab in an abandoned city where alien influence seemed faintest. Screens flickered with light that responded to thought, and instruments recorded fluctuations in reality itself, bending, twisting, and shaping data in ways that defied physics. It was not just science, it was a collaboration with something beyond comprehension. As they worked, the team noticed subtle effects. People who observed the signals for long periods began to change. Their senses sharpened, their memories expanded, and their understanding of probability and causality deepened. But there was a cost. Sleep became difficult, emotions intensified, and the line between reality and perception blurred. The aliens were teaching them, yes, but not gently. Outside, the world continued its quiet order. Governments were shadows, industries ran themselves, and humans lived as if guided by invisible hands. Some found comfort in the alien influence, believing the future would now be safe. Others grew restless, sensing that freedom itself had been stolen, even as life improved. Mara realized the signals were not warnings, they were instructions. The aliens were preparing humanity, shaping them for a future that could not be understood fully. Perhaps the war had never happened because humanity had been chosen for something else, something bigger than conflict. But there were those who resisted. Secret groups formed, trying to disrupt the aliens' control, believing that independence was worth more than safety. They sabotaged machines, destroyed crops, and spread misinformation. Yet every attempt failed. Every rebellion was neutralized, not by force, but by circumstance. Roads would close inexplicably, tools would break, communications would vanish. The aliens did not punish, they simply made human defiance impossible. Mara began to understand. The aliens' victory was absolute, not because they had destroyed humanity, but because they had rewritten the rules of existence. War was no longer a choice. Resistance was impossible. Survival was ensured. And yet, the alien influence was not cruel, it was precise, deliberate, and almost nurturing. One night, as Mara stared at the signals, they shifted suddenly, forming a pattern she could finally interpret. It was a map, not of Earth, but of possibilities. The aliens had already won the war, yes, but they had left a path open. A path for those who could understand, who could see beyond the rules they had imposed. The revelation shook her. The war might never happen, but the real test was not of weapons or armies. It was of imagination, courage, and the willingness to step into the unknown. Humanity had been defeated, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could still write its own story within the boundaries the aliens had drawn. Mara knew that following the map would be dangerous. It led to places where the alien influence was strongest, where reality itself seemed to bend. But she also understood that this was humanity's chance, not to fight a war, but to reclaim agency in a world where control had already been taken. She gathered a small group, engineers, scientists, and thinkers who had spent years trying to interpret the signals. Each of them had changed in subtle ways from prolonged exposure. They could sense patterns in data that others missed, anticipate changes in their environment, and even glimpse faint traces of the aliens' presence. They were no longer ordinary humans, they were something new, shaped by guidance they barely understood. Their journey began in silence. Cities passed by without interruption. Rivers flowed perfectly. Machines functioned flawlessly. Mara realized that every step was part of the aliens' plan. They were being tested, not punished. Every obstacle was a puzzle, every path a lesson. The first trial came sooner than expected. A massive storm, unlike anything recorded in history, blocked their path. Lightning danced in impossible directions, yet none of it harmed them. Mara realized that this was not natural, it was designed. To proceed, they had to think beyond conventional logic. By observing patterns in the storm, predicting its movements, and moving in harmony with it, they passed safely. As they progressed, they encountered others, humans who had chosen comfort over curiosity. These people lived in cities that seemed frozen in perfection. They marveled at the visitors' daring but did not understand it. For them, the world was safe, and that was enough. Mara and her team, however, felt an unease growing within them. Safety had been imposed, freedom curtailed. The war might never happen, but the true test was whether humanity could reclaim itself within invisible boundaries. Days turned into weeks, and the map led them to a place unlike any other. Mountains rose impossibly high, rivers flowed upward, and the sky shimmered with colors that did not belong to Earth. Here, Mara felt the aliens' presence most strongly, not threatening, but vast, incomprehensible, and patient. Finally, the signals formed a pattern she could understand fully. A simple message, almost human in its simplicity. You have learned. You have grown. Now choose. The meaning was clear, and yet terrifying. The aliens had already won the war, but they offered a choice: accept the world as it was, perfect yet controlled, or step into the unknown, risking chaos and failure to reclaim true freedom. Mara understood that this was the purpose of the war that never happened. The battle was not fought with weapons, it was fought within the minds, choices, and courage of humanity itself. Her team faced a decision. Some feared the unknown, preferring safety and the guidance the aliens provided. Others, like Mara, felt a surge of determination. To truly live, they had to step beyond the invisible boundaries, even if it meant losing everything they had ever known. For the first time since the aliens arrived, humans had a path that was truly theirs. The war had never happened, yes, but now, the real challenge had begun. Mara and her team chose the unknown. The moment they stepped forward, the world seemed to shift. Cities shimmered and trembled as if testing their resolve. Rivers curved in new directions, and the air itself pulsed with energy. It was disorienting, beautiful, and terrifying all at once. The first few days were the hardest. Food became scarce in ways that had never happened before. Machines they had relied on failed. Maps no longer made sense. Even the team's own memories seemed unreliable, as if the aliens had taught them to trust patterns that now no longer existed. Yet, despite the challenges, they pressed on, guided only by intuition, trust in each other, and the faint resonance of the alien signals within their minds. Other humans watched from the safety of controlled cities. Many called them fools, lunatics, or worse, traitors to the perfect order the aliens had created. Some tried to intervene, fearing that stepping into the unknown would bring disaster not just for Mara's group, but for the entire planet. Yet no intervention succeeded. The aliens' influence subtly prevented interference, not through force, but by shaping outcomes so that the path forward remained theirs alone. As they traveled, Mara began to see the purpose behind the aliens' guidance. Each challenge they faced revealed something about human nature: fear, courage, ingenuity, and empathy. The alien war had not been about destruction. It had been a test. Every obstacle, every invisible barrier, every moment of guided order had forced humanity to grow, to learn, to prepare for a choice they could not yet fully comprehend. Then came the turning point. A vast expanse of land appeared, untouched by human development but impossibly ordered. Forests grew in perfect geometric patterns, rivers flowed like spirals, and the mountains rose with precise symmetry. Here, the aliens' presence was strongest. Mara felt a consciousness that stretched across the land, vast and patient, observing every movement, every thought, every hesitation. A voice echoed, not through ears, but through the mind. It was neither threatening nor welcoming, merely certain. You understand now. You see the limits and the possibilities. Your war is not ours to fight. Your victory is yours to define. Mara realized that the aliens had never sought to dominate in the usual sense. They had removed the possibility of conventional war to teach humanity a deeper lesson. True power did not come from force or fear. It came from choice, courage, and understanding. Her team was changed. They had lost the comfort of controlled safety, but gained awareness, perception, and a strange kind of freedom that humans had never known. They could create, destroy, and shape in ways their predecessors could not imagine. But with this freedom came responsibility. The real war, the war of understanding, of choice, of growth, had just begun. Mara looked at her team and saw determination mirrored in their eyes. Humanity had lost the battle it thought mattered, but it now had a chance to fight a greater, unseen war, the war to become more than it had ever been. The further Mara and her team moved into the alien-shaped world, the more they discovered about its strange rules. The boundaries that had once constrained humanity were no longer absolute. They were flexible, but only for those who understood the signals. It was as if the aliens had created a sandbox. Freedom was possible, but only if humans could see beyond the patterns they had been trained to follow. Each team member began to change in unique ways. Some developed intuition so precise that they could predict natural events days in advance. Others gained the ability to communicate without words, sharing thoughts and ideas instantly. Mara herself felt her perception of time stretch and compress, allowing her to see the consequences of actions before they occurred. Yet the deeper they explored, the more they realized the aliens were still watching. It was subtle. A shadow flickered where none should be, a gust of wind redirected their path, or a signal pulsed faintly in the air when doubt or fear arose. It was not oppression, it was oversight, like a teacher observing a student learning to walk. Tensions arose among the team. Some feared that the freedom they had gained came at too high a cost. Others argued that true growth required risk, uncertainty, and even potential failure. Mara reminded them that the war that had never happened was not over, it had only changed form. The challenge now was to prove that humanity could rise without being forced, to fight a war of will and understanding rather than weapons. During one night, Mara experienced a vision. She saw Earth as it had been before the aliens arrived, chaotic, violent, unpredictable, but also full of potential. Then she saw it as it had become under the aliens' guidance, perfect, safe, but static. And finally, she saw a third path. Humanity shaping its own destiny, still observed by the aliens but acting freely within the possibilities they allowed. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The team began experimenting. They tried altering landscapes, redirecting rivers, creating structures, and influencing events. Some experiments failed spectacularly. Others succeeded in ways that amazed even Mara. Slowly, they discovered that the aliens' influence had limits, not in strength, but in intention. The aliens had not imposed absolute control. They had created conditions, teaching humans to act responsibly within them. Word of their journey spread among humans who remained in the controlled cities. Some were inspired, joining the explorers despite fear of the unknown. Others clung to safety, insisting that the world's perfection was preferable to freedom. Conflict arose, not violent, but ideological, as humans debated whether the war that never happened had truly ended, or merely transformed into a higher test. Mara realized that humanity's future depended on understanding this new war. It was not about winning against an external enemy. It was about learning to exist in a universe shaped by intelligence far greater than their own. The aliens had already won the old war, but the new war, the war of freedom, choice, and imagination, was still very much alive. And so Mara led her team onward, knowing that every step forward was a rebellion of the mind, a declaration that humanity could rise above the inevitability imposed upon it. The war that never happened had taught one lesson: victory was meaningless without growth. The true challenge was just beginning. Mara and her team stood at the edge of a vast plateau, overlooking a world that was both familiar and utterly transformed. Rivers flowed with impossible precision, mountains rose in geometric harmony, and forests stretched in patterns that defied human logic. And yet, beneath this perfection, Mara sensed possibility, space for growth, creativity, and choice. The aliens appeared, not as beings, but as a presence. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, a consciousness that seemed to breathe with the planet itself. It did not speak aloud, yet its intention resonated in every thought, every heartbeat, every glance. "You have learned," Mara heard, though no words were spoken. "You have understood the rules. You have discovered the boundaries. Now, what will you do?" The meaning was clear. The aliens had won the war that humans thought mattered. Humanity had been shaped, tested, and guided to a point where conventional conflict was impossible. But now they were free to choose their destiny within the possibilities that had been set before them. Mara looked at her team. Some were filled with awe. Some were terrified. Some laughed at the absurdity of it all, humans, victorious in a war they never fought, yet now facing the real challenge, freedom. They began to experiment. Cities were rebuilt in ways that honored creativity and community. Crops and rivers were redirected to serve both sustenance and beauty. Technology advanced not merely to dominate or survive, but to explore, understand, and connect. Slowly, humans learned to act with purpose within the alien-designed world, discovering ingenuity, resilience, and wisdom they had never known. Those who chose safety remained in the controlled cities. They lived comfortably, unaware of the larger possibilities beyond the invisible boundaries. But Mara's group spread the understanding that freedom was not without risk, that true victory required responsibility and courage. The aliens observed, always present, never intervening unless necessary. Mara realized that their purpose had not been conquest or domination, it had been preparation. Humanity had been tested not in war, but in the capacity to grow, to adapt, and to choose wisely when the illusion of control was removed. And in that moment, the world shifted again. Not because of force, but because humanity began to act as more than it had ever been. The war that never happened had ended, yet the real story had begun. Mara looked toward the horizon. The future was unknown, chaotic, and thrilling. The aliens had already won the war, yes, but they had given humanity the greatest gift, the chance to write its own story within a world of infinite possibility. And for the first time in history, humans understood that victory was never about defeating an enemy. It was about discovering what they could become when no one controlled the outcome. The war that never happened was over. Humanity, shaped by unseen hands but now free in mind and spirit, had begun the journey of true freedom.